So Jim, you've been studying recently the Severan period of the Roman Empire, which is the 2nd and into the 3rd century. And that is one of the first historic examples of a truly global society, all the way from the northern part of what's now England all the way down into Greece. So lots of different ethnicities and people with different cultures, but unified in this empire and by the common languages of Latin and Greek. And so how did that cosmopolitan global society, how was it reflected in their art and their architecture?
Well, you have this power, Rome imposing itself on these different ethnicities. And over time, the time period that I'm particularly interested, the one you mentioned, is relatively late in the empire. It was a time when I think that people in the empire started to believe, most in a unified way across the empire, most in that idea of a Romanness, rather than these different regions that were forced to cooperate. And I'm interested particularly in architecture, in the way that architecture makes use of all sorts of images and frames them, either public architecture, like what you'd think of, the grand forum spaces, the arches you would pass under in a city, pick any city anywhere in the empire, you'd find those. Dining rooms, how they put, people put in their homes on display these images. And there's a common language that emerges from this imposed, in a way, at first use of images, but that can be taken up in a variety of ways, but from a variety of different points of view. My first book was on the architecture of porticos, the colonnaded walkways, and I talk about that. This is a good example of what you're asking me. I talk about that as a space which allows a kind of repetition as you walk among columns, but it's a cell, a spatial cell, in which you can perform your own version of that common identity. So it's both a homogenizing form, but also it allows for an individual expression, an individual experience. And so, yeah, I think that's the nature of this global Roman culture.
And so do you see, as you study this really ancient society and these ancient architectural structures, do you see any parallels to what we're doing nowadays in our very global society?
I do. I don't make the mistake of thinking they thought like we think, but we do, they and us both, use images to manage this complex multicultural world. And I have to admit that as a scholar, I think a lot of the questions I ask come from my existence in a very complex global world. I mean, any historian is playing with history in a way to answer just the questions of their own lives. So yeah, and I think students actually pick up on that about Roman culture particularly well, that there's this kind of image culture project which creates an idea of unity, even though real life, of course, may not provide that exact kind of unity.
And in terms of providing a global perspective to students, I know that you oversee and create the study abroad programs for art and architecture students. And tell me a little bit about that. That's a great opportunity for our students at the university.
It's been very important to me to bring international education to students, partly directly just to take them to see some of the things they've learned about in class, but much more importantly, to operate as a global citizen, to feel comfortable moving into different cultures and different environments. I've done tours to Greece and to Turkey. I've worked in architecture in Rome for a summer where the students were actually taking apartments, taking classes in classroom spaces, and then having lectures out in the city of Rome itself. And most recently was in London with a colleague, Janet Williams, a ceramics artist, basically treating the students to a really in-depth museum and gallery in a cosmopolitan global city in London.
And do you see evidence of that experience in those students? I mean, is there just an immediate impact on them?
Oh, yes, because we always, at least I do, have them do scholars' journals as part of the assessment of their self-assessment and then my assessment of their experience. They always begin, many of them, with fears and anxieties, like never flown so far, wonder what it's going to be like to be in a place where I don't speak the language. And they realize as of course everyone does who travels, that it's really an easy thing to do. And they have this kind of confidence. And I think that that's perhaps the single most important thing about international opportunities in education is they just have to see firsthand that it's quite possible, and they may do it again in their own terms.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking today.
Oh, a pleasure.
Yeah.